So if that's all right with everybody, I'm going to jump right into it. So thanks everybody for attending episode 17 and Let's Talk Recruiting. I don't know if you know, but we just started a podcast. So if you're in the podcast, I make those available on recruiting.work on Apple and Google and Spotify. So I try to disperse that out as much as we can. I don't know if everybody saw Joe Rogan just made $100 million deal on his podcast.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I guess there's a big point
let's
to
do
that.
it.
Right,
Let's do
right.
it.
We're on our way. So today's episode is going to be, it's called The Ultimate Checklist When Hiring a Recruiter. And we have representatives, I think, from across the country here. So we're going to kind of do a roundtable with each of our panelists, bringing up a key item that they think is one of the top things to have when you're doing that recruiter hiring for recruiters. So we have Devon Parrish out of Austin. We have Alexander Moore out of Houston. And there's Simone. We have Simone Press out of LA, along with myself out of the Los Angeles area, and Christine Brown out of Atlanta, and Richard Sternin out of the San Francisco Bay Area. So let's jump right into it. And Devon, I'm going to go to you first with your item.
Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Devon Parrish. Just to give you a little background on me, I've got about 14 years of recruiting experience, both in the agency and the corporate world. Most of my experience is on the corporate side. I started in technical recruiting and actually have built several teams along the way. So where I am today, it's mostly a very various different types of corporate roles, from accounting and finance to marketing, et cetera. So for my team, I really need generalists on my team. So in hiring, I'm not necessarily looking for just a technical recruiter or accounting and finance recruiter, et cetera. So a couple of things that stuck out to me along the way, definitely have made some hiring mistakes. And so, when you learn from those, two big items that I picked out to talk about were organizational skills and then stakeholder management. I think as recruiters, especially if you're in a larger organization, you might have 20, 30, 40 recs on your plate. You might have 10, 15 different hiring teams that you're working with. So being able to stay organized is extremely important in my book, and one of the things that I really look at for a recruiter. And so when I'm talking to candidates, there's a couple of ways that I kind of screen for that. I always love to do scenario-based questions. To me, that's the easiest way to figure out, if this person is really living and breathing that. So a simple question, for me, is just how do you organize your day, your week? And then I usually drill down into that with, what does your calendar look like? So I'll have somebody actually walk me through, their calendar, and here's how I organize it. For me personally, what's always worked for me, things like color coding on my calendar and blocking time and that sort of thing. So, those are the sort of things that I look for in my candidates as well. But that's one easy way. And then the other is stakeholder management, as far as what's important to me. Again, if you have a lot of recs, or you've got a company where there's a lot of moving pieces, being able to really have that partnership with your hiring teams and be able to really manage their expectations, day to day, week to week. And so one of the, again, scenario-based questions that I use, I try to pull each company that I'm at, I try to pull real-world scenarios. In my current company, our CEO is very active in our talent acquisition and our recruiting. So one of the scenario questions that I ask candidates is, let's say the CEO calls you and asks you why a position isn't filled after a week of working on it. What do you do? And usually I get a pretty good response, and I tell candidates that's a very real situation that could happen. The other is, let's say, kind of going back to organization and stakeholder management, let's say you have 3 jobs of equal importance that you're working on. How do you prioritize your time and your activities? And then also, I like to ask what the most creative solution to a problem is that you've come up with. To me, those are again, scenario-based, real-world type situations, and usually can get some pretty good insight on those 2 topics.
Devon, do you ever, around this scenario-based questioning, do you ever go into role playing?
I don't. The one aspect that we kind of do in that sense, we do a case study. So I created a case study that's essentially, again, a real world scenario of a rec, of a hiring team, kind of give them the background and then ask them to build a 30-day recruiting plan for that rec. So, that's kind of a role play, but no, I don't, do the verbal role play like some companies do.
How about it on the panel? I've never done it or gone through a role. I've heard of it. Has anybody experienced that or done that when they're recruiting their team?
This is Christine. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, currently working for a financial institution, but I do the verbal just because it catches people off guard. I think it's easy to poll your friends and kind of prepare, where I really want to get more of a feel, and something that I look for, I think, is someone who kind of pushes back the norm. I look to hopefully learn something during the interview, and that usually gives me a good indication this might be a good hire. So I want to go past the internal database and LinkedIn and pray. I want them to, so I tend to do more verbal assessment similar to what a gentleman was saying earlier, but I do it kind of, tell me your thoughts, kind of walk me through it now in person.
Does anybody ever do, kind of sticking to Devon's scenario-based piece, and this may not be a direct match to it, but do you ever give people a psych test? Like a psychological profile one? I've taken one of those in the process of getting a recruiter job in the past, but just one time. Does anybody do that?
I'm going to jump in on that one and say absolutely not. like specifically, absolutely not. By the way, my name is Rich Sternin. I run AI hiring for Ernst & Young globally. Nice to meet you all. The whole issue of neurodiversity and addressing mental illness in the workplace, and there's a few frontiers that are not being addressed. I really don't think a psych test is an appropriate measure of how to hire someone, because it really does take all kinds of neurodiversity and neurodivergence to make teams work well. So,
Walter, this will probably make you even more happier about this. And when I took it, this was a long time ago. This was still back in the agency days. Your profile had to match the profile of the two top recruiters, and if you didn't, you didn't go forward. So it was like,
what?
This was in like the late 90s, so it was back in the day. And is an agency store, or agency shop with maybe, I think we had 18 locations across the country. The owner sat, 10 feet from me, so it was that kind of a place. You couldn't get away with it now, but all they did was, and you couldn't have any recruiting experience. And I won't name names, but you also couldn't be a woman. It was all young men. No experience in recruiting, match this profile. So you basically had to be competitive and all that type of stuff. But again, that was in the 90s. They're still in business and doing quite well, so I'm not going to name names. They've evolved. They've evolved, let's just say that. But that was my introduction to the world of agencies. So it was quite interesting, to say the least, when you get introduced to recruiting as a whole, especially if you take that agency route into it. I haven't been in an agency since like 2001, I think, so it's been a while.
So interestingly enough, it's Simone, by the way. I was part of a process probably close to 8 months ago, and Red Bull does do a bunch of psychometric testing. So actually, if you are interested in any sort of role within the company, and that can fall within, people ops, it can fall within talent acquisition, they actually have a whole sort of test that they send you. Interestingly enough, I didn't get any follow-up either way. So I literally got the results of my test, but I never got any information from the recruiter or from the talent team about anything. I just had gotten basically a form email after I applied to a role. And they essentially said, oh, hey, thanks so much for your, application. You looked really interesting. It made me spend about 45 minutes filling out this, specific psychometric test, which, by the way, was really interesting. And I think it was particularly interesting because you're sent the results. So it essentially can show you, and I think that gives you, again, in that kind of situation, there was no end result for me necessarily, but it was interesting and it was a great experience, and you walk away with a bit of information. So there's that satisfaction piece, I think, that you receive just by being part of the process. But interestingly enough, they're still doing it, at the psychometric level at least, which I found really interesting.
And I'm sorry to jump in one more time on this. The reason I'm passionate about this is that, even if you go to the EEOC list of disabilities, right, which include bipolar, PTSD, and a whole bunch of different things, there are people who have measurable disabilities, right, who are exceptional, absolutely exceptional. And that's also part of the whole idea of creating a culture of inclusion and not just diversity, right, which is, I know, is on all of our minds. And at EY, we've actually started, this is sort of more of a broader level, but we've started centers specifically for neurodiverse people. We take that into consideration a lot, and I think it's important to be very careful with those tools. Although I agree, Simone, they're super interesting.
Yeah.
I would love to take one myself to find out what a nut
They're
I
super
am.
interesting, but I think to your point, honestly, I think there's a lot that happens with the extrovert versus the introvert. And I think that, beyond just the neurodiversity piece, like think about so many people where you get feedback. And again, this is beyond just recruiters, but like, you have so much feedback from teams where they're like, well, the person just like didn't seem passionate. Well, maybe they're just introverted. Maybe they don't have like, a ton of, specific passion around something that you would identify because it's different than your own. And I think that's the piece that we're missing sometimes. So it's really interesting.
Yep.
I think for me, I will say, while I don't use it for selection process, I do use it for my onboarding. So I do have just like a free one that's out there that I use. And it really just more so just matches so I can better manage. But there are, like you spoke, Simone, that there's different personalities. One's going to be more to a verbal. One's going to, I have one that definitely could just shut down. I know I need to give her a day and talk to her, but some of that, and when I'm trying to pick projects and matching to lines of businesses, it kind of helps to have that. So I do use it more as a get to know you tool, but not part of the selection process.
Interesting. All right. Any other comments to add to Devon's? I'm a big fan of the scenario-based recruiting. It gets into the people's ability versus just that ability to interview. So I like those. That's why I was asking about the role-based scenarios, if you get into that a little bit deeper. All right. Alexandra, let's sort of jump over to you.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. My name's Alex Moore. I work in Houston. So Alexandra is my name I go by because it's less of a mouthful. You can always call me Alexandra. And I work in Houston for a consulting firm called Credera. And so Credera is a management and technology consulting firm. I've been here almost 4 years. And building off of some of the conversation today, we believe deeply in structured interviewing. And I love what we've heard so far about the pluses and benefits to the different scenarios that you can run people through. And we don't do cognitive testing for the recruiting team, which is why I was, not inputting there. But what I wanted to get to just from my lessons learned, and I'm actually going to try to speak to some of the chat questions that have popped up. Thank you all so much for sharing in the chat section what you're curious to learn about. So in my experience, I love what we talked about so far, but what I've seen is in the different recruiting environments I've worked in startups, I've worked in consulting firms, I've worked in the agency world, and every single company I've ever worked for needs a different profile of recruiter. Now, I'm not saying there is a fixed recruiter that's never going to change, but what I'm getting at is you need to know and fully be deep in the skills, both hard and soft, that are required for a recruiter to be successful at your firm, and not just looking on paper to identify that. And what I mean by that is we have an extremely high talent bar at our firm to be able to do what we do in the consulting space. And we were recruiting a recruiter one day that had just phenomenal experience from on paper at a competitor with a really high bar. And we loved some of the concepts that she talked about related to how they screen, and her just experiences seemed aligned enough with how we typically recruit. Well, we brought her in, we plugged her in a role, we had high hopes and expectations for her, and it didn't work out. And it was purely because we focused on the wrong things associated with what we loved about her high bar and some of the kind of creative ways that she partnered with hiring managers, but she couldn't do the job or understand the profiles that we were looking to have her go after. And so it was just a complete mishire on our part. And so we tweaked our process to go after a profile that actually had more experience, a little bit more tangibly associated with the different recs we work on and the partnerships with hiring managers. And so the other kind of 2 cents I'll add to another experience we had in hiring is that we need recruiters that are willing to challenge the hiring manager. So the good news is that my firm is we're not order takers, and our leaders need us to not only be willing to recruit on the recs, but to think critically about the recs and try to solve our problems associated with why we're not hiring fast enough or why we're struggling to find a certain profile, and bring solutions to hiring managers. And so we've learned that not all recruiters in other companies are given those sorts of opportunities. And so we've had issues, what I would say, to work on and course correct our recruiters on whenever they haven't been able to perform in that way, which our hiring managers expect our recruiters to do. So to speak to some of the questions, what I wanted to address is, first off, I would say if you're a recruiter that has been impacted by COVID-19 and you're hearing some of these concepts being discussed today associated with how companies are making sure they hire the right recruiters into their teams. Go into the interview knowing you only have the experiences that you have. However, when you're interviewing, ask questions to understand the nuances of that company's culture of recruiting so that you can speak to your situational answers. So yes, I don't have a behavioral example to show you I've done this before, but this is how I would approach that problem, or this is how I would approach that scenario to prove that you can have more of that growth mindset associated with evolving your skill set into the profile that that company needs. And so make sure you realize that the company you're interviewing for is not going to be like the company you just worked at, and do your very best to show that you're willing to grow and acquire these new skills by asking the right questions to understand what those nuances are. And then the only other thing I wanted to address really quickly, because there was a great question about the startup recruiter. And a lot of recruiters can be kind of pegged as I just want to work 8 to 5. I'm not really trying to hustle and do whatever it takes. And I absolutely agree. You know, there's been a consistent thread on my team that agency background actually does help with that. Now, I'm not saying all agency recruiters are hired or are created equal, and not every agency recruiter we've hired operates that way. But I will say, you not only need to say, okay, agency recruiters might be a good fit for that hustle, but you need to understand why the agency recruiter is a good fit for that hustle and what those specific skills they've developed in the agency world would translate into that hustle in your model. And so that's been something that's really worked out in our favor.
Excellent. Kind of on that same note, you think that applies, I think one of the comments was they're jumping from one industry to another, right? From education to corporate employers. Mm-hmm. How do you think that applies in that world where it is, I mean, you even look at like a nonprofit, right? That's sort of different than corporate hiring and stuff like that. So from nonprofit or education, getting into the corporate role, any suggestions around that?
For the recruiter that's trying to make that transition. So once again, I really think it's about asking the right questions to understand what makes a great recruiter on their team, and then being able to, on your feet, quite frankly, speak to why your experience would translate into that model. So in my experience mishiring, I've now learned as the hiring manager to ask questions to help guide that conversation. But as the proactive recruiter trying to differentiate yourself and show you have those transferable skills, you need to ask the right questions to then be able to speak to either the way you would handle those scenarios or why your experience would actually translate in that way.
I was also going to just state that if you are in a field that's kind of outside of the norm of, you know, what we would call corporate recruiting, you have to kind of think outside the box as a candidate. I mean, I think the reality is, and we know it, right? Like a large number of recruiters will be looking at a list of people who applied to a job, and they'll be like, this person just doesn't have the right experience. This person doesn't have this. This person doesn't have this. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, if you're trying to influence the team, right, without actually having a phone interview, let's say, you have to like think outside the box. And I think in your case, you know, if you're in the admissions, you know, specific sector of a higher, you know, educational institution, if you do admissions, that is a very tough role. That is recruiting in the truest sense. You're essentially, you know, reading people's applications, you're understanding, you know, what they have to offer, and then you're, you know, pushing them against a benchmark basically and making a decision that will affect the rest of their lives. I think you should probably think through like sort of industries that are similar. So for example, maybe there's an educational tech company that's looking to hire a recruiter. You can sort of leverage your experience and show why you particularly have been able to do that. Potentially there's a role within, you know, the team at the university that you work at, more of a corporate role. Once you basically get the title of recruiter, you're going to be in a much better position to get that corporate role. The other way to look at it is learning and development. That's another interesting area. Of course, it's different than recruiting, but like learning and development, you know, having that educational background, having that ability to kind of build programs, that stuff is also really key. So you have to think sometimes outside the box. It's incredibly difficult, especially in this economy, to get interviews and to sort of get even past that first stage. And I think it's on you as the candidate to think about creative ways to sell yourself, not oversell, but just sell yourself like the perfect amount, I think.
I will piggyback on that too. I've, you know, even when I look at internals who may be outside my organization who want to come in, I look for kind of that mindset that when you break down recruiting, it's sales, it's marketing, right? and with skill sets that I think work well, curiosity, customer service, that service to mindset. So being able to display those things where it may even be through community service or in your current role, a number of referrals you bring to the table, I think is very transferable. And I've hired people from agencies. I hired people from stuff like Europe or some of these programs, or like you said, admissions, and they've been very successful. Sometimes the actual operations piece of recruiting is very teachable, and what's not easy to teach sometimes the organizational skills that I think Devon mentioned earlier. And sometimes when you get someone who doesn't come with a lot of bad habits from recruiting because they come from a different field, it can be a plus when you're trying to balance what you have on your team. So definitely keeping an open mind on that.
I could jump in here too. I think that the idea of bringing your book with you, your book of contacts, is great. It's also timely. Because everyone can build a book of contacts relatively quickly, depending on the industry. Personally, and my last hire was literally the mascot from the Oakland A's, like literally. I hired her because of what that meant, who she had to deal with, the pressure she was under, and she had also worked for the Oklahoma State Legislature. Those two things combined gave all of the components of an amazing recruiter. Well, at this time, she started as an RC. She was the best RC I've ever had. Right now, she's at Google doing recruiting analytics. So I think and then that's not to say that someone who brings a book of business is not valuable. It's incredibly, not book of business, book of contacts is incredibly valuable. I just think there are a lot of looks. I think since I ran my own companies for 17 years, like I had sort of a different approach where I didn't hire recruiters almost ever as recruiters. But when I work for other people like Ernst & Young, you have to go more by the book. So I've been going more by the book.
Yeah.
But there's just a lot of cool angles, I think.
Richard, you bring up something, and I'd like to ask the panelists if I can ask a question.
Absolutely.
In a recent search that I did, I had a candidate I felt very, very good about, but then when I looked at their LinkedIn profile, they had very few contacts. And so I went to my peers, to my circle, and said, you guys, what do you think about this? Because I read it as being someone who wasn't connected, who wasn't networked. If you're really the star recruiter, at least your candidate should be connecting with you, and you should be working outside of LinkedIn, and, you're not able to use some of these other tricks unless you have a good pool there. I looked at it as a negative. One of my very dear friends who I would always would bring with me a company who's great, she actually brought the point that she doesn't, and she's mainly worked for kind of like consulting firms where they're a little bit more prescribed, and maybe she just, she really had less than 500 contacts. And I was like, well, I know you. I know there's not an indication, but I don't know. To me, it just seemed like a red flag. And so I say that to the greater group, in that make sure that you're you're active. Some people judge, but I'm welcome to ask the panel if you also look at that as a kind of a red flag when you're considering a recruiter.
Anybody want to chime in on that one? I have a comment, but I'll let others jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, from my perspective, yes, it wouldn't necessarily stop me from having a conversation with somebody if I thought that their experience looked like, could be a good fit. But yeah, I think we all know LinkedIn is a pretty strong tool for us. It's certainly not the only tool. So I would have some concern, depending on the level of experience and how many years. But yeah, if they will, content, pushing content. I don't push a ton of content on LinkedIn, so to me that's not, as important. But yeah, I would certainly wonder a little bit if they didn't have, a decent amount of contacts based on their experience.
Christine, I would totally agree. I think that it's sort of, I would liken it to Facebook profiles with like 5 people on Catfish, the show, right? Like it's the same kind of scenario. You're like, wait, hold on. Like, why does this person only have 100 friends? Like, right? Like if your industry is recruiting, if your bread and butter is building connections with people and building meaningful connections where they do walk away from the relationship and want to connect, then yeah, there's something going on there. And potentially that person has a second profile, or potentially they have something where they lived abroad and in other countries, they might not use LinkedIn as much. And you have to think outside the box around that too. But don't necessarily there's something going on there potentially.
Yeah, Simone, totally agree. And by the way, I only have 100 Facebook friends. Yeah. I have 300. My wife is a filmmaker and she's got 3,000, and I always tag her. Anything, but I agree. Not just at recruiting, but even if someone's the mascot for the Oakland A's, Tanya had she had tons of LinkedIn connections because she was active in her communities. So it still speaks to the kind of activity they have regardless of the field they're in. So I actually would look at that as something of a warning sign with some.
And it's a tech savvy, depending if you need that too, right? Like it just kind of, it gave me pause when I had a good friend who said, well, I actually don't have a lot because I do X, Y, Z and do all these other things. I was like, I don't know, I don't know if that's the norm.
Yeah. So I'm going to interject real quick. And I always thought it was kind of a red flag if you've been a recruiter for more than 2 yeez. Sort of call that into question. But it's kind of in the interest of time, Simone, I'm going to jump over to you and sort of keep the roundtable going here. Can we jump over to you, Ina?
Totally. Thank you, guys. And thanks for hosting this, Sean. I've seen this group kind of blossom, and it's been really cool to watch. I remember when we talked in the very beginning, and it's just kind of like grown and grown and grown. So congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So my whole thing. So I basically actually just relocated back to the United States this past August. I was living in New Zealand. And I was leading TA for a educational tech startup in that space, which is why I was kind of likening your search, I think it was Chris, to potentially thinking outside the box when it comes to roles in ed tech, because there's a lot of stuff out there. Currently, I'm actually running my own business, and I'm working closely with startups in the LA area. I'm currently partnering with a company called Wit Media Group, and we focus in on a B2B SaaS platform to help essentially large entertainment companies do a lot of the back end process. We also have a really fun consumer app called TV Time, where you can kind of follow a bunch of shows and share with your friends what you're watching. In terms of sort of today's conversation, I agree with Devon. I think you mentioned the fact that assessments and thinking through, or not necessarily assessments, but, really having a structured interviewing process, like all of those are going to be really key. I was going to talk about hiring recruiters through the lens of diversity and inclusion. I think that with a lot of recruiters and a lot of recruiting managers, the first thing is to go to people they know, right? To go to like the 5 or 6 people in the recruiting industry that they know or that they've worked with and bring them over to their org. And I think, the reality is when you're hiring, a team, you should really think outside the box, as I've mentioned a couple of times. And I think, we talked about structured interviewing. One way to do that is through assessment-based interview questions. I'm a big fan of them for every other role. Why not just incorporate them for recruiting too? You can basically give someone almost a fake search and say, hey, who are the types of people you'd go after? You can hone in on how recruiters think, what they know about, how they problem solve and client communication. Like those are all potential assessments. You can even have an assessment around like, how would you push back against a hiring manager when they don't want to follow a process, right? Like stuff like that is really key, especially at the junior levels. If you're hiring a recruiting coordinator, you want that recruiting coordinator to understand how to communicate efficiently, and that's a great way. I mean, I think at the end of the day, like recruiters are gatekeepers in their own right? Like, I used to work at Amazon before I moved abroad, and I was at Amazon and I was leading recruiting specifically at Amazon Studios, which is a content organization. And at the end of the day, it's the same with recruiters, whether it's content or whether it's recruiters. These people are gatekeepers. They are reading resumes for people who are coming into an organization. If we don't have a diverse team that has different educational backgrounds, different thought process around, the world view that they share, if they've not lived in a variety of places, if they don't come from a socioeconomic background that's different, we're going to get the same people consistently. If you hire somebody who went to Harvard, there's probably going to be a high chance that they want to hire other people who went to Harvard. It's the same kind of thing. So I think, there are so many different ways, as I mentioned, eliminating bias with assessment-based interviews. I think the other thing is to know your own biases. If you went to a certain school in a certain place, if you have people from your old team that you want to recruit, know that. The best way to combat bias in hiring your own recruiting team is literally knowing exactly what you would usually do and then stopping yourself from doing that. And I think, to be consistently honest with yourself and the team. If likability is a thing, again, we've been talking about qualitative. A lot of people are talking about how they want to hire somebody. Same kind of thing with Obama, right? You want to have a beer with him. That's the whole thought process back in that election. If you're thinking through the prism of hiring your own team, if likability is a thing, denote a number, like build in a score, like essentially say if likability is a real thing, let's create a consistent numeric score where people can control it and we can understand like, oh, I liked this person more than this person. Like the more numbers that you put into a process, the more sort of quantitatively you can think about it, which is, in theory, a fairer system. And I think there's a thing, a specific bit of information from Intel. When they started requiring managers to interview a more diverse set of, candidates, they saw the percentage of new hires from underrepresented groups increased from 31 to 45%. If we are setting goals that are meaningful, you know, and again, this is across whether you're hiring for a recruiter, whether you're hiring for, you know, different types of roles within this company, it's going to be meaningful and it's going to translate in reality, you know. And I think just ensuring that you have a really diverse and collaborative interview group. If this role is coming on and supporting your team, it doesn't necessarily mean that it should only be recruiters and HR partners that are, you know, sitting there interviewing. Have somebody from the business, have the COO interview the person, have like somebody from the sales team. Sales and recruiting and marketing, as we've already discussed on this call today, is all critically important and very similar. So I think the more you can kind of add in people to the interview group, the more effective a process you'll get and the better feedback you'll get that kind of holistically can evaluate a candidate. And the other thing is, remember RC. I don't know if anyone was an RC. I wasn't an RC. I was an assistant at a news company, but still, like, RCs are always forgotten about. When we're hiring a recruiter or an associate recruiter, we're going to immediately go to people who have recruiter titles in their name or in their current title. Don't do that. Go to recruiting coordinators. They are going to be the most passionate, the most organized, the most ambitious. They want to grow. They understand how recruiting works. They understand how to partner and what a recruiter needs. They're your, start looking outside the box when it comes to like different candidates coming in, and interview people that you might not want to interview, or that you are like, I don't know if this person, give them the benefit of the doubt, I always say. So that's like my little piece.
I have a question for you on that. By the way, the RC thing, man, my RCs had veto power practically. Like, yeah. If they didn't like them, done. And honestly, like, if someone came in for any role and they treated the person at reception differently, they were out, done. Yeah. Like, yeah. That's just something that I can't deal with at all. But I'm just curious, did you ever track retention rates for diversity hires? Because what I found at some places was like, you do the work, you lay the groundwork, you bring people in. I had a company that was almost all men when I started there. I got them up to like 23% women, but the culture was not changing, and it was not an inclusive place. And so we kept losing women. And to be honest, rightly so. I will not name the company. And so that part is hard. I've been tracking as well, along with in what teams. I don't know if that's a metric you got going yet, but just curious. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. I think, you know, specifically, I personally think hiring across all levels is incredibly important, and having a diverse pipeline at all levels. The reality is, at Amazon, we were tracking a variety of different numbers around hiring. And interestingly enough, you know, if you put more female candidates and diverse candidates at the top, you know, for those senior roles, you know, there was an increase, but believe it or not, they weren't getting to hire sometimes. So, you know, there's different numbers that you can track, and I think they do tell a lot, you know, of a story around an organization. I haven't been doing that at the most recent company that I've been partnering with, but yeah, that's a really good call. Like, not only saying that you're going to have diverse, you know, set of candidates coming in, but actually tracking it through onboarding, through the first year, seeing attrition numbers. That's really key.
Yeah, Richard, I've done that, where we track that retention rate of the diversity. We kind of followed it from soup to nuts to the very start, where we would track the diversity of applications, submittals, interviews, hires, all the way through retention rates. And then we would separate it a lot by a management level. So we could look at executives versus managers versus individual contributors. We even, and this is sort of goes back to Simone, to your point about recruiting a diverse set of recruiters to ensure diversity in your company. Where there are hot spots, we'd also look by recruiter. Like, are we following the funnel of diversity all the way through by recruiter, to make sure every recruiter, because they are, to your point, one of the gatekeepers, are living up to that expectations. So this was at a company that was heavy into diversity, because their business depended upon, well, not dependent upon it, but was very inclusive of it. So it was a big emphasis, know your numbers. We don't want to hear the stories. We want to see the literals going through it. So it's very interesting to see where it is and how it goes through, and then I'll kind of, if it isn't going out the door, you know, a year later or 2 years later, or even promotions. So looking at your diversity program and promotion. So it's kind of connecting recruiting with HR, right? From the soup to nuts.
And it should be connected all the time. I think that's like something that we consistently forget about. Like, after onboarding, recruiters will just be like, yep, he signed the offer, that's it, done. And then like, the reality is, like, there's so much more to that story and that user story if you're like in tech.
Right. I think Workday's selling that point with their Workday recruiter. It's all connected, but you got a whole other list of problems. All right. Anybody else to add to Simone's comments? All right, fantastic. I think Simone, D&I has gotten a big jump start. Hopefully it looks like it's going to keep on continuing. I don't see it regressing in any way, the way the industry is going and the attention
Actually,
that it's getting.
one comment on D&I and how important it is I'm going to take Amazon as an example. All right, Amazon built this recruiting product, right? That was an AI-based recruiting product that was designed to shove in like 100 resumes. It would kick out the 2 you hire, and then that was it. It would basically make recruiting driven by NLP and a couple of forms of AI. And it was built basically by a non-diverse team. And they trained it. Well, I don't know if it was, let me, what I factually know, it was trained on non-diverse data, 10 years of hiring data. In other words, white dudes. So the AI did what it's supposed to do, the model was trained and it started saying, all women, nope, we're only going to recommend men. And the whole thing about diversity, especially, not especially, but in artificial intelligence, without diversity in your teams, you build flawed models. And that's why Google's reverse image search wouldn't understand that someone could actually be a black person, that instead they thought they were an animal. It was the most disgusting thing, and Google had to remove that result from their search. Like, that's because the people who were designing the training data, which is what makes AI work, were not diverse. The impact is all over the place. Those are 2 big examples, but there's more. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
No worries. Going back to the, hey, how do I jump from one industry to another? I think that might be another little point to bring to the table, especially if you are in a nonprofit or a school. Here's what we did around diversity. I would bring that into the conversation if I'm trying to get my foot in the door to the business world.
The other thing I was going to say is actually like just another way to think about that. If you're trying to get out of your specific area of expertise with admissions, look at people on LinkedIn, use LinkedIn to see if people have jumped from admissions to a corporate role, and then reach out to them and say, hey, I want to do the same thing you did. How'd you do it? That's a good way to do it too.
Now's the time. All right, Christine, let's sort of jump over to you. And we're past the 30-minute mark. Is everybody still good to keep going? Right?
I'm good.
Oh,
Yep.
cool.
Christine Brown. I have about 15 years of recruiting experience, starting in agency, doing temp, then direct hire, then the consulting. Then I went in corporate within a media company, handled corporate from F&A to technology, strategy, everything under the corporate umbrella, and then moved on to financial services where I am now. I truly, as I stated earlier, believe that recruiting is a sales and marketing role. I also believe that you're only as good as you treat your candidates. And so when I'm looking for recruiters, I'm really looking for that customer service, the person who can take the time to call the candidate back, to set, pre-screen them and set them up for the interview, to follow up and to every referral and has that touch, because good candidates equal good referrals. Good candidates become hires who become good hiring managers because they love the way that they were treated. And I think during good times when there's not a lot of candidates, those are the ones that send you or remember you. So I'm really big on candidate and kind of that consultative mindset, and also looking for recruiters who know how to understand data and analytics, who I understand to pull this information from, Career Builder or Compare or whatever they're using, and this is what the market, and can relate that to the manager. And so I will kind of piggyback on earlier, the agency mindset works well. Someone who, I'm not going to just sit here. I want to go and do internal client visits to my managers, attend their meetings, even though I'm not invited, but I know they meet every 3 o'clock, and really understand the business and what they're doing. Find out what organizations that feed into that business and educate their managers to help them recruit and come up with different staffing plans, and really think about it from a consultative nature and not afraid to have the hard conversations. This is the purple squirrel. This is why this is going to be hard. This is what you can expect, and really do those types of things. So, and I think it's important just with the market is tight right now with so many recruiters being able to do the COVID, but even without COVID, AI is changing our job. You look at like everybody get the LinkedIn updates. It's doing more and more and more what we do, right? It's making it easier and easier. And LinkedIn's going to be ATS soon, and it's going to own the market and really change the recruiting job, I believe. So if you're not already adding value by being consultative, being really the business manager, you should, I tell all my recruiters that you are, wherever your function, you're Scrum Master LLC, that's your agency, you're an intern agency for us, and that's how you should treat your business here when you're dealing with. And so if you're not doing that, I encourage you to do that, and I also encourage you to continue to learn, attend these webinars. Kudos to everyone who's here who's doing this and other topics. What are the new technologies? Try out new things. Join those Facebook groups. And so that way that you're ever involved in adding to your skill basket so that you're staying relevant in the space that you're in. And I think it's helpful to have things like the PHR and things like that, just to understand some of the generalist duties and red flags. You can add value in other ways, maybe within, because right now I'm working on projects for internal gig economy. So that's more talent management, but maybe TA, maybe they have a hand in it. And so having some of that workforce management skill sets can be helpful too. So I went fast. I know we're short on time, but that's a couple of things that I wanted to put out there.
One thing for a tell for me from that, does a recruiter take that consultative approach, is do they go into team meetings? Right? Not intake meetings or meetings around the rack, but they step in when their team that they support. Yeah. It's like, if you got, the gumption and the confidence to go in there with that team, I think that's a tell that, hey, you are taking this consultative approach, because being a good consultant means you're listening. So it's being part of that. Was always a tell for me. But yeah, I love the consultative approach to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have anything to add to Christine's piece on that? All right, Richard, let's jump over to you.
My time to shine. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, my name's Richard. I feel weird saying this out loud. I've been in recruiting for 27 years. I ran my own companies for almost 20. I sold one, 2 went well, and 1 imploded fantastically. That one is the first time I had investors and partners. Learned more from that one than anything else I've done. Worked for startups for about 6 years, but then the global head of AI for Ernst & Young asked me to come help redo their AI practice, because that's what I did for 3 years at a startup. So I've been there for a year. It's actually it's a project-based thing, but it's been amazing. So, I don't really tend to hire recruiters who've been recruiters. I just don't. And the reason is, I feel like you can have a blend of experience which lends itself well to what we want to find in a recruiter. And this is just my way. There's a million ways to do things right. And trust me, I've also found a million ways to do things wrong. So, but I explained that my last hire was from the Oakland A's as a mascot and the Oklahoma legislature. I've hired a creative director. I've hired a tech person. I really look for, can they write persuasively? Can they talk? Are they inquisitive? Will they challenge me? Literally, are they unafraid to be like, dude, you're wrong? And then how do they accept being told, I hear you, but no, right? That's an important thing for me too, because that happens with hiring managers all the time. You have to be willing to say stuff to them, but then you have to be willing to accept the results. I have a bunch of, I don't do role playing, but the scenarios I do are tailored to whatever their work environment is versus a job thing. Job thing, that's the technical term. But I quickly went through all the things that were sent over as things that people were interested in, that Sean sent over. And very quickly, this is my reasoning for doing it. Alexandra's back. Hello.
So sorry, everyone.
Accounting, accountability, translatable from other jobs. Adaptability, translatable. Coachability, translatable. Their communication style. Their curiosity, super important to me. Very translatable from other jobs. If you go down I was looking at the things that interest the people here, and there's almost nothing here that's not translatable from other roles. So my whole approach, and that's really all I have to say on it, is that I really look for the communicative excellence, which I was raised in an ad agency, a branding firm, and my whole family makes a living by writing, except for me. So I'm very tuned into how we're delivering the message and how succinctly to the right audience, whether it's hiring managers to candidates and whatever, and how well the people I hire can do that in their own style. Because I do not want a clone, like that woman I was mentioning, Tanya, is not a clone of me. She's also yelled at me before, which we always laugh about now. But she was unafraid to push back, and she had a lot of great ideas, some of which we should never, ever, ever do, but they were good ideas. All that to say that I'm just looking at this list really quickly. Resiliency, how to handle stress. You can get that from other jobs. Their presence, that's translatable. Their attitude, organization. There are some things that may not be translatable, but they're highly teachable, like advanced LinkedIn searches. Like I can teach Boolean searches, I'm happy to. After I sold my first company, I was a corporate trainer for 2 years. So I have the fortune of being able to write curricula, and I still train people. I train people in Manila, actually, for Ernst & Young. So that's a very disorganized way of saying that I think great people can be found anywhere. And to the person who put in that question about how do we hire someone who's been like sort of driven by commission and get them to work, in a way where it's not that kind of instant reward structure, that's another way to do it. Because these folks I've been hiring are just from other industries, but have translatable skill sets. Whew, that's all. Thank you.
So let me ask you this, Richard. Aside from, like, nobody went to school to become a recruiter, right? Everybody, it's not a major in any school that I know about. You talk about becoming a recruiter, coming in from different areas. I think that's kind of the story that everybody has. Mm-hmm. But let's jump up to I've only really seen it hands-on one time, where you talk about the leader, right? The VP of recruiting, a director of recruiting who's leading the whole show. They came in from the business side to run recruiting. Mm-hmm. I've never seen it last more than a year. And they're like, oh, not what I thought. And then they're moving on to something else. What are your approaches to that level, coming in from a non-recruiting background, coming in to lead a whole program? Has anybody ever seen that one?
Yeah, I mean, just personally, and this is just off the cuff, that's a different thing. Like, that's a different story. I honestly would highly recommend against that, I would think, because you can teach someone to recruit, and then they learn if they love the field, and then they become they have their own style, and that's sort of a wonderful growing experience that's good for everybody. But at a leadership level, I look to people, to tell me, what they think is best. And if you have a leader who doesn't really have any clue, then.
Yeah, so Sean, to that point, I've actually reported to two different people, oddly enough, at the same company, who were both outside of the talent acquisition or HR organization that came in and ran all of HR. So one of them was our COO that we pulled in, who was our chief sales officer, who I reported to for a while, and then it was our chief administration officer when our CHRO left. I will say the benefit to that is that they brought unique end user perspectives on, what the challenges are. But to Richard's point, they had absolutely no input or value to me when I had a challenge, when I wanted, a talent acquisition perspective or an HR perspective on something. So really, it was, hey, Devon, here's all the problems, right? And here's what we see from our side as an end user, go fix them. So, it was good because I got to see their perspective, but from a true leadership perspective of what we needed as a recruiting organization, it was still ultimately up to me to fix it.
Yeah, I think that I would say that there's, in my experience, I've had a couple of people that I know, the guy who actually heads up the team over at Square, who I think is fantastic. He came from sales at Google, and he now heads up the recruiting team at Square, right? And the way that team is built out, he's sort of, I don't know, whatever the senior level is, SVP, VP. And then essentially below that, he has leads that have, functional recruiting experience. And essentially they mentor, foster the relationships with the teams, build the teams up, deal with a lot of the day-to-day troubleshooting. And I think that that's probably a really solid model, because then you have that perspective at the top where it's like, okay, these are the things we need to accomplish. This is how we're going to accomplish. I'll be communicating with everyone, other executive peers, our strategy, once I hear from the recruiters on how to deliver that strategy. So I think, it totally depends. I think a lot of the smaller organizations, you can't get away with having someone senior because there's not enough of a full team built out. But I think if it's a big, opportunity, and if it's a big team, you can certainly build in those mentor kind of figures within some of the smaller teams, sort of satellite teams, which I think can be effective. I think it's really great when you see people from other backgrounds. I mean, I started in recruiting from media. I was a writer, actually. And then before that, a lot of the people that I worked for were in the news industry. That's all we do is ask questions. We're literally interviewing people. We're producers. We're producing things. We're project managing. So I think, the skill sets are really similar. It's just about the functional expertise in those pickles, and as Devon had mentioned, when you're like, hey, so I have this role, it's been open 6 months, I can't close it. Like that person's not going to be able to add anything to that, discussion. But, if they have the right sort of lieutenant in charge, then you'll get that support from that person.
Yeah, the thing is I hear you, but I sometimes feel like then maybe the lieutenant should be in charge. Because like if it's a role and they're leading recruiting, like I totally think, and I realize that I'm sort of flip-flopping based on how I hire people to become recruiters.
Yeah.
I learned from everyone, which is why I still like recruiting. But I feel like my leader, I need to look to, for leadership in what he or she is leading. And so if they have an awesome lieutenant, and the thing is too, is I don't know if you know Spotify, but Spotify had a head of recruiting who decided that, I like individual recruiting. And he promoted someone who worked for him to be his boss, right? Because, and I'm saying this because he realized his lieutenant would do a better job. And she did, and she's amazing. So like, I just think leaders need to be able to lead. I see your point too. I'm not totally disagreeing with you. I just sort of a personal.
My 2 cents, I've had both, and I kind of tell my team that I think I'm successful because I've done the job. And I think what happens when you bring someone at a high level from different departments, they're making decisions that sometimes don't make sense once you put them in real life. We should implement this and do this, but if everybody workload's at 60, that can't really happen. It's unrealistic expectations. So you spend a lot of time in level setting and going back, but they're out singing, taking feedback from their level, and trickling down policies don't really work. And that, unfortunately, has kind of been my experience when someone comes from outside of, who doesn't have any tangible what the desk life is, and so can't really relate to be honest.
Interestingly enough, I have that experience from people in recruiting. I find that so many people, let's be real guys for a second here, a lot of people in recruiting who are recruiting managers have not done actual recruiting in years. They don't really know. They're kind of just 9 to 5ing it a lot of the time. They don't necessarily bring people in who are going to challenge them. There's a lot of flaws within how recruiting operates. And I think the reality is if you're at with a TA manager, a lot of them TA managers I've had, they've had histories, long careers in TA. And the reality is I'm still not getting, the answer that I want to get when it comes to a really functional question or something, so like, I totally understand everyone's argument. I think sometimes a new perspective is more helpful than having someone who's been in it, 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago, right? Like they're just out of it a little bit. But yeah, I totally get it.
So the final thing I'll add, and I agree with a lot of this, I will say that I'm in a current dynamic that is working extremely well, where I would say that I'm more of the lieutenant, but I report to a managing partner who has never done recruiting in his life. Wow. But the thing that I haven't heard us say that he does extremely well is he leads with curiosity. So he's not just here to tell me what to do. He's here to make sure he understands the nuances and the difficulties and the challenges of recruiting to help me think critically about the problems I'm trying to solve to make me better as a leader. And so I agree with the concept that it can't just be one, but I do think there's a ton of value to learn from someone with a different perspective as your leader. But I've also been in environments where it hasn't worked well. But that's the one thing that I think really differentiates him is he has a true interest and curiosity in what I do that challenges me and makes me better.
Yeah, I kind of bring up the whole leadership premise because I just think as the country gets through this crisis we're all in and all the states start to safely open up the doors and restart again, and everybody's kind of, okay, go. It's just a hunch. I just think we're going to see leadership involvement in recruiting like we've never seen before, or at least in my lifespan, where if you've depleted your employees going through all this, now it's time to, okay, we're starting again, and everybody's starting at the same time. It's going to be, or near the same time. It's going to be an interesting, quote unquote, game to see how we get that talent back, and the people who got let go, are they interested in coming back? Do we want them back? And all that type of stuff. And it's going to be on the leaders, I think, a lot, because it's so going to be such a jump start to business again.
Yeah, there have been a really interesting Harvard Business Review podcast about this. There was one that specifically said that you got to furlough people. You can't just, completely lay people off. Furloughing builds a pipeline of that talent to come and rejoin the organization. So your recruiting team, who was at 5, suddenly doesn't have to balloon to 15 to, you know, accomplish the goals. So yeah, this is gonna be a really interesting time. What does everyone think about how the economy is gonna look in the next 6 months for recruiting, like just within a talent acquisition field specifically?
I ebb and flow. I mean, when it first started, I thought it was going to be a V. I thought we were going to have this drop and then straight up, and now it looks like it's going to be a longer pause. But I do think that companies are taking advantage of it to push maybe agendas. You know, maybe they had this what we should call it 2020, but this forward plan of automating more things, but they were trying to work through the culture shift, but this has allowed them to push those. So I do think possibly by the end of the year, we may be back up, but looking for totally different. I think there'll still be downsizes, and then what they're hiring will be totally different skill sets to meet kind of the way the business has changed.
Are you referring to recruiting or to like the business in general?
I mean, recruiting within business, because like obviously business is going to pick up eventually, but like, you know, for people, you know, all the people part of this chat who want to get into recruiting or who are making shifts, like, is this a really good time to do recruiting, or should you kind of go back to what you were doing before? Like, what do we envision over the next 6 months for this particular industry? There's a lot of agencies that are like furloughing people, laying people off. Like, there's a lot of like, you know, internal people that have been, you know, I see resumes every day now. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, in Silicon Valley, it's the amount of like, you know, there's that term FANG for like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. Like their hiring has gone crazy. And the number of positions that are open for recruiters for Facebook and all these guys is remarkable. I've actually been pretty shocked. I heard
that Facebook was actually slowing down. Like they have a couple of tech recruiters, but yeah, Facebook's put a real pause, I've heard.
Then they need to take down their ads, my friend. they have like 17 ads up for recruiters. Yeah, I can ask some friends of mine there, but well, appearances can be deceiving.
I mean, Richard, sort of getting back to your bringing in these specialties around recruiting, and this is like I just had a conversation with somebody who's I don't want to name any names, but in Silicon Valley, big tech company, hardcore software engineers recruiting for years now. Now they're going through layoffs. Well, before they were having, you know, a high percentage of offer declines. So we've been able to compete with the FANGs, even though they should have been added to that list. But they would have people that were just dedicated to closing the people. But to deal with that, because those software engineers are in such high demand, they need people to specialize in that closing piece, and that was all that they would do. I've never seen that before, so it's sort of interesting to hear that story. But kind of getting back into, hey, that's a unique skill set, may not have anything to do with recruiting, but the ability to get somebody to accept that offer and the reasons why, and sort of relating that back to, hey, if businesses picks up again, that's an interesting skill set. If it's few and far between, but
biggest challenge at EY. You know, I work for like what's known as a Big Four accounting firm. It's 301,000 people, right? We're supposed to compete with Google, and the biggest challenge, and it's privately held, so there's no RSUs, there's no options, there's barely any bonuses. They only pay cash. They don't know how to compete in the field. I hope there's no one from Ernst & Young on this call. But the whole thing that we had to do was learn how to tell the story. And the story actually was not necessarily about it's Ernst & Young, but about, oh my God, the amount of data that we have, the stuff that we have, like the story of what we can actually build and why we can build it differently than anyone else, appealed to AI scientists, appealed to data scientists, but people had to learn how to tell that story. That's been maybe half the battle. Comp has been the other half the battle. But that, again, I think that's teachable if the foundations of the person's, you know, inquisitiveness and ability to learn are there. So I'm not sure if I just spoke to what you were talking about at all.
You're on. I just sort of throwing some curveballs out there as I'm having more of these conversations with stuff. People are, you know, opening up, and you're starting to hear about how things work on the inside. Every company's, I always say they're 80 to 85% the same issues, same problems, but that final 15% is unique to them. So it's just sort of interesting to see how, like we talk about full life cycle recruiting versus specialized recruiting, and then you get into high demand roles like software engineers or what have you, versus, hey, you got to cover 4 different business units. Kind of, I think, Devon, you were talking about that, where you got to recruit for everything, and just how to deal with that and stuff like that. All right, at our mark, any final comments? Anybody want to add anything to the group? Otherwise, I'll end there at the hour. I apologize if you had any place to be, but the conversation was going really good. So any final comments?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Good.
Oh, thank you. It was so nice meeting you guys.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of your week. Appreciate it.
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.